When I was 25 and a half, I started a podcast. The goal? To review some of the newest and latest movies, along with some other stuff. With the help of my guests, I was able to do this, but there were dark forces tampering with my podcast, and with me. They called it an improvised podcast for some reason. I eventually found help in the form of myself. Yes, the me from a universe where the movies I reviewed got delayed. Apparently, my podcast made it to his universe. I know now that it is my duty, for the good of that universe, nay, the multiverse, to keep recapping and reviewing these movies, to hold listeners over until they could eventually see the movies as they were made in their world. For some reason, they come out differently in my world, but it's kind of entertaining that way. My name is Steven Shinder, and this is Delayed Replay. Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Delayed Replay, that podcast where we usually recap/review movies that got delayed in that other universe. But this is another one of those weird episodes, I guess, where we talk about those Space Jam sequels and spin-offs that came out in our universe, but also have like the memory erasing feature at the end. I'm your host, as usual, Steven Shinder. This episode is probably coming out like a few days earlier in the week than it normally would. It's going to come out Wednesday the 16th, which just so happens to be a year after the Star Wars Episode 1 Racer Remastered episode came out. So, yeah, it's also my brother's birthday that day, so like happy birthday to him if he's listening. He also loves Space Jam, like we both grew up on it. But my guest on this particular episode, you may have heard him on the season 2 premiere about the Kingsman, where I had like a few friends from across the pond over. It is Ted Richardson, aka Gitbag the Great, from Ted's Booze Cellar. How's it going?
It's a real pleasure to be here. People will sort of kind of probably regard me as much more of a cynical and somewhat negative film reviewer than yourself. You generally tend to have a lot more positive views about certain things, and but generally speaking, I think we it's funny. I think me and you, we always disagree on like what we find good, like and bad, but we tend to always come to some agreement about like fundamentals of like enjoyment and sort of general quality. Like I hate Star Wars Episode 8, for example. You really like it, but we also agree on certain fundamentals, like Snakes on a Train is worse than I Rot, so, you know, that kind of goes without saying.
Yeah, like Episode 8 is middle of the road for me, but I do think it has poignant moments. But of course, you and I have like disagreed on certain things, but I feel like I am negative on certain things. Like, if you listen to the Paranormal Activity 7 episode that I recorded with Greg, I was pretty down on like some of those movies. Like some of them just aren't really that much of my cup of tea. So yeah.
I mean, it's also that sort of, I prefer quite older films, so I generally tend to prefer myself action films from the 80s and 90s, or sort of high concept sort of films from the 2000s or the 60s and 70s. So it's really, I kind of just go for more so what I'm in the mood in terms of music, but with like film, you can always narrow it down to like 2 or 3 subgenres of what I'm going to watch.
Yeah, like I have a bunch of things on my Netflix list, and sometimes it's like, even if it's something I've chosen to like, oh yeah, I definitely want to watch this later at some point, it's like if I'm in the mood to watch something, I'll like go down the list and I'm like, I'm not so sure if I'm in the mood for it, and I'm just so like indecisive with that stuff.
I mean, it's like my sort of recommendation on like Amazon Prime Video is basically just like pretty much just low budget B horror films where like people bloody sort of like set everything up with you know, a budget of like a packet of fudge pops and like $200 in the 80s, or they're sort of crazy action films with like Arnie and Stallone in the like 80s and 90s, where they're clearly like roided out but like, the villains still like underestimate them, even though they look like literal gods amongst men, and they can carry like 4-barreled rocket launchers.
Yeah. Yeah, speaking of movies from the 90s, you've seen the original Space Jam, right?
Yeah, again, I feel I'm probably a bit more negative on it.
Yeah, probably.
It was, I mean, my quintessential animated movie of the 90s has to be probably the Prince of Egypt.
Oh, yes, that's probably my favorite animated movie of all time.
Yeah, it's really, it means a lot to me personally. And it's just generally very, very well made and done film. And I'm not a big fan of Val Kilmer, to be honest, but his vocal performance as Moses is actually really good. But like, I remember I went from watching that to watching Space Jam, which I think came out a few years earlier, and
yeah,
perhaps it was just the fact that I'd watched one of those two first, and in that order, and then that kind of coloured my judgment of Space Jam, because I just watched Prince of Persia, which is Prince of Egypt, and it's such a different film, so perhaps I judged Space Jam unfairly. But looking back at it now, I don't think I did, because I hate it. I don't think it was great. Notwithstanding the weird, really kind of uncomfortable scenes with Lola, and you can tell someone definitely had a great time designing her scenes.
Yeah, it's really weird to me the way some people react to Lola Bunny, and like, yeah, it's weird. I don't think you judged it unfairly, because like I've definitely seen Space Jam first, and I had it on VHS. I loved watching it as a kid, but when I watched Prince of Egypt, like later, like when we had it on VHS, like I loved that like a lot, and so like even though I had seen Space Jam first, I still ended up preferring Prince of Egypt overall. Like the soundtrack is just really on point. The animation looks great. It's just it's a solid depiction of the Book of Exodus story overall,
Mm.
So, like, just to recap how like the Space Jam film series turned out in our universe, because like some people forget about it because of the memory racing feature. So we have the original Space Jam, and then we have Space Jam 2, where like Michael Jordan is kind of just phoning it in. Then we have Spy Jam with Jackie Chan, and then they did Looney Tunes Back in Action, which had a cameo from Jeff Gordon, and now we have Race Jam, which we're talking about, where Jeff Gordon is more like the race car driver. He's more of the focus, and this would be followed by Skate Jam, and now like this year's Space Jam: A New Legacy. But we're talking about Race Jam now. Are you like into like watching race car driving, or like playing any race car driving games? Like, what's your take on like the whole thing or genre, I suppose?
It's funny because I'm not massive. I mean, I like watching F1 now and again, but primarily I just like playing racing games for just the fun of it. Particularly, the version of Ridge Racer that was on the PSP, Crash Team Racing, Garfield Kart, definitely. Yeah,
Wait,
no,
Garfield Kart is a thing.
yeah, it's definitely a thing, and it's a lot more upsetting than it sounds. Actually,
I've never heard of this.
I'm being facetious. I don't actually like it. It's a terribly made like shareware game that was like just slapped together basically. But yeah, it's I don't know. I like racing games. Racing movies, weirdly enough, I've never really massively been into all that much. I know we were speaking a little bit before about like the weird product placement in Fast and the Furious, and those are kind of racing films for the first, I guess, 3 films, and then it just turns into like, hey, let's see how much stuff we can blow up while somehow wedging cars into the story. But I don't know. In terms of racing films, not massively, no.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan either, except a couple of the Cars movies. And I love, when it comes to games, I did love playing like a couple of the Mario Kart games and even Diddy Kong Racing. But
Diddy Kong Racing was amazing.
Yeah. So good.
So underrated.
Yeah. So when we open at the beginning of Race Jam, so it kind of has like this flashback to that cameo in Looney Tunes Back in Action, where like Yosemite Sam steals Jeff Gordon's car to chase after like Bugs, Daffy, and like the human characters. And now we start off with like Jeff Gordon is like trying to file a lawsuit against the Looney Tunes for like what happened with his car.
Yeah.
I thought this was kind of a funny way to like tie the continuity together. But what'd you think of like this court scene and how it played out?
I know it was kind of. It's aged very strangely in the sense that like it's a cute sort of like through line between the two films. But and it's quite a hammy scene, and like I think throughout the film, the hamminess does kind of wear itself a bit thin. But like for that introductory scene, it actually suits it quite well. To be fair, so it honestly works quite all right. It's got a lot of that kind of sort of hey we're back kind of writing that's like very situationally effective in the sense that it would only really be it can be kind of funny, but it can only be really super funny to people who've seen the previous films. So I think it was a funny scene, but I think that was also helped by watching the previous films in concession.
It's kind of funny because they call Porky to the witness stand, and Porky's like, "Yeah, I wasn't even in that scene." And then, like, when they question him, he's like stuttering, and it's like he gets like so under pressure that he ends up fainting. And like, I thought that moment was kind of funny.
Yeah, and then he just like starts sweating, and like someone in the background just makes like a backwards comment of just like, "Hey, can someone smell pork scratchings?"
You know, I don't know if you've ever watched like the Looney Tunes show from the early 2010s, but I just remembered how like in that show Porky is like eating pepperoni like it's no big deal, and he eventually finds out what pepperoni is made of, but he just keeps eating it. And it's like, wow, how they get away with that in that show. Yeah, like this court scene, like eventually it doesn't really come to like a logical conclusion, because like, you know, it's Looney Tunes, and so you have like some race car drivers like crash through like the building, and then it's like Jeff Gordon begrudgingly decides to like team up with like Bugs and Daffy to like race after these people who have like stolen some race cars, and they have like one of his cars, so it's like he wants to get it back. And so I thought it was kind of a flimsy way to like have him team up with the Tunes, but I mean, with these types of movies, like, what can you expect, really?
Yeah, it did feel sort of like it is a bit kind of like that sort of writing where it's just like, well, we've kind of started to run out of ideas. Might as well just slap these two groups of characters together. Which I kind of get. Like, I guess the previous films were so successful that they kind of felt inclined to sort of make another film, but at the same time, like by this point, in terms of the context of these films, I really feel they'd probably run out of like stuff to do with them, like they did with. Well, I mean, to be fair, I was going to use the example of the 4 sequels to the Scorpion King, but then again, like, why the Scorpion King? The Scorpion King movie itself wasn't even that necessary to begin with, anyway. So, but yeah, I feel like by this point, you know what? Even by Skate Jam, they probably started to run out of ideas in terms of writing, and I definitely feel like by the time this film came out, it was like starting to really just feel a bit like a corporate sort of chain of just films that were just produced to just make money. And so like they kind of just thought, well, we've got to put these characters together somehow, and it did feel pretty lazy in that regard.
It even feels lazy to the point where they're even like reusing an actor, because in Back in Action they had Steve Martin playing the villain.
Yeah, he was great.
Yeah, but in this movie he's back playing a different character. He's like playing an inspector. And
they kind of describe him as well, don't they? As like the good cousin or whatever. It was something like along those lines of the villain in Back in Action, and it's just like, come on! It's like when Disney released the sequel to The Little Mermaid, and the main villain in that was Ursula's until that point unmentioned evil sister, and it's just like,
Oh wow.
yeah, it's so lazy.
Yeah, and I get the sense that they cast him as an inspector because they knew that the Pink Panther remake would be coming out the following year, so they kind of wanted to get a jump on that. But yeah, I don't know. What'd you think of Steve Martin's performance in this one?
I respect him for the effort he put in, but in kind of a similar vein to a lot of the characters and actors who were present in previous films, I definitely feel that he was hampered a bit by the quality of the material. Because I mean, even as sort of like substandard as it was in points in terms of like the quality of the material in Looney Tunes Back in Action, it was still funny enough that where you could genuinely see his talent shining through. Here, it's like it's more so that he's struggling to make use of the writing that he's got at his disposal, and you're just thinking like, God, I feel bad for him because he's just wasted talent here, and it's just like. It's like oh, he's funny, and then like halfway through the film you're just like, this is depressing because this just isn't funny. Like, it's really bad.
Like he's basically like this inspector who's just like investigating, like he's basically following like all of the race car drivers, like the bandits as well as like Jeff Gordon and the Toons. And it's like, what is he even doing here? Like, what's the point of him?
Yeah.
Like they eventually end up in Chicago, which I mean, yeah, I wasn't sure like what the reason for this was, but I guess they needed like some big city in here.
I think it's sort of like it was sort of starting to get into that era of like animated films, or like those kind of films that were sort of live action films, but like were based on animated IPs or like standing franchises. You know, like the Smurfs, Superdog, and Fat Albert. And to be fair, I think they kind of tried to link it back to the first film in a sense, in that, you know, Michael, you know, obviously basketball is featured a bit in this film. And basketball was the main through line of the original film, in that, you know, Michael Jordan is obviously a hugely famous basketball player, and he did play at one point for the Chicago Bulls. I guess they were linking it to that. But then again, they kind of displayed it kind of like New York, in that like a lot of lights and advertisement, like really weird out of place ones as well, for like Chipotle and like Heinz, that were just like given no real through line. Like the characters would be talking around, standing in like the middle of like a square, just like talking about their problems, and just in the background you just see a massive unavoidable like Snapple advertisement, and like that would be the drink that like Bugs would be sort of drinking in the next scene. It's just like, it just doesn't feel very subtle, really, does it?
Right. And I mean, with the Chicago Bulls thing, like Daffy does ask Bugs like, hey, didn't Michael Jordan play for the Chicago Bulls? And Bugs is like, yeah, but we couldn't afford to bring him back in this movie, so let's just move on.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few bits of writing. That's the reason why I wouldn't say this is wholesale awful film, in the sense that there is little bits of writing like that in it, where they reference to like real life stuff, or like events throughout the series of films, where it's just like, oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, it's like very there is actually a couple of bits of writing like that throughout this film that is a bit more subtle. It does make me appreciate it a bit more. I mean, it's definitely better than the Fat Albert film. But then again, you know, Gut Rot is better than the Fat Albert film. So what can I say?
And like with the Snapple thing, like the bottom of the caps have like these factoids generally, and so like when Bugs like reads the bottom of the cap, he like the audience doesn't see it, but Bugs like reads what's gonna happen at the end of the movie, and he's like, hey, good to know. And it's just another one of those like meta things which these films are known for.
Yeah, it was weird. It was kind of like it happened a bit in going back to it again in Looney Tunes Back in Action, and also Josie in the Pussycats film. It happened a bit in that one as well, because that was released a few years before this one as well. And I just like it was, when I was younger, I didn't really catch on to those kind of bits of like comedy, even though they were trying to be subtle in a very unsubtle way, if that makes sense. So, but yeah, no, I am looking back on it now, it's actually like really kind of annoying. oh, here's something where wink, wink, foreshadowing about the finale. And it's like, come on, dude.
Yeah, I actually watched Josie and the Pussycats for the first time earlier this year because this other podcast I listened to called How Star Wars Is It did an episode on it, and like one of the things they talked about was how like some people at the time didn't realize that it was satire because like that movie is about it, like it's supposed to be like anti-commercialism, but it has like all these like blatant advertisements, and some people are like, "Oh, they messed up," and it's like, no, it's satire, you morons.
Yeah, and it's just, and it's also sort of kind of, I guess, covered up a bit by the fact that it does have a lot of, at the time, really popular actors like Tara Reid, Rosario Dawson, Alan Cumming, who I completely forgot was in the film until like really recently. Yeah, it's weird as well, and I also feel like people forget that it was also based off of like a really old show as well. So I don't know, it's a weird old case. To be fair, I actually really like the 2001 Josie and the Pussycats film. It's actually but it's not even a guilty pleasure. It's just generally enjoyable, which kind of makes it all the more galling that I think it fell short of its. I think in terms of gross revenue to like the budget that was spent on it, I think there was a distance of I think like between 7 to 15 million. So it didn't do too great.
Yeah, I found it to be a fun movie. Like it feels like the overall feel of it like for somehow reminds me of like the aesthetic of an Austin Powers movie, but with less cringeworthy things in it.
Yeah,
like,
I kind of
yeah.
I felt a little bit like that with Back in Action as well, and to a certain degree, this film and Skate Jam as well. Actually, I think like the last few Looney Tunes Jam films kind of had that sort of feel to them as well. Actually, because I mean, most of them, the last three were obviously made in the 2000s. To be fair, so that kind of fits the bill, really.
Yeah. Obviously, since they're in Chicago, it's like they really play up the whole Windy City thing, and so you got like really like fast winds causing the cars to like fly up in the air, and it's just really over the top, and as they like race through the city. And yeah, I mean it's really weird, but that's these movies, I guess.
Yeah, it's kind of just something that you kind of just got to expect with these kind of films that were made during the early to late 2000s.
There comes a moment where Jeff Gordon is like, he feels like really washed out and he needs second wind, and he's like, you know what, when I need to get my energy back up, I just get like a good drink of Heinz ketchup. It really gets me going. Heinz ketchup really doing stuff, and then he like squirts it in his mouth and like gets more energy somehow.
Yeah, and it's just like, on one hand, it's like, okay, I get they're trying to be funny, but it's also just really gross, because why would you just drink ketchup? But then you just think about it for more than a second, you're just like, wow, that was a really lazy and cynical product placement. That was kind of insulting.
Yeah, and I mean, when there's a scene where they like take a break to eat at Subway, Daffy squirts the ketchup all over his sandwich. Like he drenches it in the ketchup. So it like, even though they're advertising Subway, it kind of acts as like an insult to Subway in a way, because it's basically drowning out the flavor of the sandwich.
Yeah, that kind of made me feel a bit ill as well, because I like Subway and I like ketchup. I want to combine them together in that manner. It was just a bit, it's just a bit horrible, actually. It just reminded me of the first time I saw someone combine smoked salmon with honey. I was just like, just made me feel really like, my skin just felt like crispy for some reason. I just felt really deeply ill and just angry.
Well, I've never heard that combination before.
Don't try it. It's not great. Try like a honey and ham or something like that. And don't try honey with fish. It's weird and its taste just bizarre.
Fair enough. Salmon goes very well with cream cheese, though, but I'm sure lots of people know that.
Oh no, absolutely. It goes really well with cream cheese in like a seeded bagel with like gherkins and capers.
Yeah, definitely. What'd you think of how they ended up incorporating NyQuil into the story, like as they're doing all this blatant product placement?
It was weird.
See, that was the only one that really felt plot relevant, because obviously in the original Space Jam, they obviously didn't. They obviously had that. Can't remember what the name of it is, but the bit where Bugs Bunny and
Yeah, he drinks water and he labels it secret stuff, and it's like a placebo effect thing.
yeah, but it's like oh, like you look back on it now and it's like crap, holy like you know, you look back on it in the context of like how many sports people from like wrestling, baseball, basketball, and sports like that did like so much steroids during the 90s, and you're just like, oh, this isn't aged well. It's like aged like sour milk in the sunshine for 10 years. But it's just so I feel like the inclusion of Nyquil, like in this case, was kind of like a reverse of that, in the sense that the main character, he obviously was like trying to keep himself from like having headaches when he was like racing, or like, and so he used that to help with it. But then he becomes like weirdly dependent on it, and they obviously kind of play it off in like a weirdly comedic way. But like when you think about it, it's like, again, it's just like that's actually a really dark, like kind of depressing through line, that like one of the main characters has to literally rely on sort of like prescription drugs to sort of function properly. And it's like it sort of then brings into the question, like sort of like how true is that with like actual like racing and sort of like public performers, like they probably go through something similar as well. And like as we've seen with sort of situations of like famous musicians admitting to that in like the last 10 to 20 years, like that definitely has been the case in places. So it's just like, again, it's something that like they probably thought of like, oh, this could be commented on as like being darkly funny, but like looking back on it in hindsight, it's actually like that's really up and actually kind of scary and depressing.
Yeah, I mean, I never realized that potential comparison until you like brought it up during this episode. Like, I just always saw it as like, the Popeye thing where he just eats spinach and then all of a sudden he's like super strong.
I mean, that's kind of harmless. It's just like, oh, eat spinach, you get vitamin C and iron. You look on this in hindsight, though, and it's just like, you're just like laughing for the first couple of days, and you're like, haha, and then just like, oh. It's just like when you think about it for more than 5 seconds, it's really upsetting and depressing.
Yeah, and I mean, it gets really like gross and blatant when, like, in this subway, Jeff Gordon goes over to like the soda machine thing, and he like presses the levers for the Pepsi and the Dr. Pepper and just like drinks both of them with his head like under them, and he's like, oh, this will improve my performance, and it's like so freaking weird.
Yeah, but I mean, he kind of did that in a way, didn't he, where it was just sort of clearly like he was like in kind of like that fugue hungover state, and he was just like some washed up has-been kind of like appearance to him in that scene, and he was just like being really slobby and just kind of sweaty and just, it was really horrible. Actually, I didn't like that scene at all. Not just because of the blatant corporatism and product placement, but just because of how like it's like just unclean that scene makes me feel. It just makes me want to take a cold shower.
And so they end up driving to Wyoming, and like Jeff asks that's really hard to say. He asks Bugs like why Wyoming, and he's like, it said to go here at the bottom of the Snapple cap earlier. And so I guess this is more of like a scenic route type of thing, getting out of the city. And
yeah, it's weird though, because it's on one hand I kind of respect that decision, because a lot of films at that time were like setting themselves in like the fashionable big cities of America, and Los Angeles or Chicago, or particularly New York as well. But obviously not a lot of them were like setting themselves in like the countryside and making use of the very nice natural scenery in the States. But then I think like, as nice as a lot of parts of Wyoming are, it's not the most interesting state. Like, it's still the most sparsely populated state, I think, isn't it, in the US? And as nice as it is, it's not that interesting. Like, it's just kind of a bit plain. Like, it's the vanilla ice cream of the United States.
I mean, I'm gonna have to stop you there and say that vanilla on its own can be really great. So like, I don't like when like vanilla is described as being bland.
Well, I'm not saying it's bland. I'm just saying it's plain. It's nice, but it's just not the most interesting thing, is it? Like, maybe I'm coming at this from a place of sort of elitism, in the sense that I did used to live in Belgium, and like every Friday I'd go to like the local ice cream shop with my mum, and I'd get like raspberry sorbet and pistachio ice cream and stracciatella. But like, I don't dislike vanilla. I just think it's a bit plain. It's not boring, just to misrepresent my point.
All right, that's fair.
But yeah, no, it was weird because it was just like they sort of suddenly started telegraphing, didn't they? Like all the sort of sites in Wyoming they were going to, and it was just like they were kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and they weren't that famous. But you're thinking like, oh, they're gonna use that in the finale somehow, aren't they? And then they did, and it was really lazily telegraphed. And even then, it just kind of didn't really take me by surprise at all. It was just really kind of by the number. I mean, throughout the film, the writing wasn't completely awful, and like the storytelling was interesting enough where it did keep an interesting through line to the point of me watching the entire thing with interest. But like towards the last like 30, 40 minutes, it just goes really paid by the numbers, and I'm just like, by that point, I'm just like, really like, my patience is really stretched.
Yeah, it definitely feels very by the numbers. I mean, even to the point where like the inspector, played by Steve Martin, gets like ahead of them and it's like, I have figured out who's behind like all this car stealing, and it just turns out to be Yosemite Sam and his like henchmen who stole all the cars. And he's like, are y'all surprised? And everyone's like, no, not really. Like it's just very lazily put together.
It's like no subtlety in terms of writing. It's just like, guys, come on, you can do better than this.
Yeah, I mean, I did think it was funny that, like, Yosemite Sam, one of the cars that he had was the Batmobile from the Tim Burton Batman movies. And then, like, since this is the year that Batman Begins would be coming out, Bugs and the rest, like, get a hold of the Tumbler from Batman Begins, and it's, like, basically having, like, the two Batmobiles go head-to-head. Yeah,
that was interesting, because obviously this was around the time when the first Christopher Nolan Batman film was coming out. Yeah, I don't know. There was a lot of sort of like cultural references as well, which sort of kind of represents like a big part of like those kind of animated films, semi-animated, semi-live action films throughout the 2000s that I really don't like is the paint by numbers storytelling, the product placement, and then obviously the pop culture references. And now that I've said that, I've just given myself a horrible flashback to the 17 Alvin and the Chipmunks movies.
Yeah, I mean, I do like Alvin and the Chipmunks meet the Wolfman, but that's pretty much it. Yeah, Alvin and the Chipmunks meet the Wolfman, most ambitious crossover ever.
Not enough people talk about the weirdly animated Alvin and the Chipmunks from the 80s with the creepy sort of like villains in that film that have faces like cottage cheese.
But yeah, I get what you mean. Like, maybe we haven't gotten completely out of this type of era, but just all the blatant product placement, it's like, it can be a bit much. Like, I feel like it kind of works for these Looney Tunes jam movies, because like people just pretty much expect it. But like, even so, you can only do like so much before it gets like really old and repetitive, I guess.
Yeah, it's if there's a formula that works, you might as well follow it, but just be one that you will have to change it at some point in order to stay sort of competitive and relevant, I guess. Which is probably why that theme of sort of like semi-live action, semi-animated films in the early to mid 2000s kind of died out within about 5 years anyway. So kind of just goes to show how much longevity that type of film had to begin with.
Yeah, and I mean, even during this final showdown, you get this random moment where Tom and Jerry like drive through in their race cars, and then the movie pauses and it's like, check out Tom and Jerry, the Fast and the Furry, coming out on whatever date it was, because like it came out like that same year.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen that one?
Yeah, I wish I hadn't.
Yeah, I remember watching Tom and Jerry, the Fast and the Furry when it was on Cartoon Network at some point. And like they're like weird like race car driver opponents. Yeah. Well, one of them was like a soccer mom. Like that was even her name, Soccer Mom, and she had like an SUV.
And then there was that weird Man Max episode that was just like came out of nowhere, and it was like, obviously it's a kids show, but it was still for kids show standards in that time. It was still weirdly violent, and I was like, hey, what the hell is this? Like, and then I remember watching it at the time and then thinking it was actually a different Tom and Jerry cartoon, and then coming back to it years later and realizing, oh no, it's actually the same series. It's just weirdly out of place and kind of dark and violent.
So Jeff Gordon finally gets a hold of his own car, and he presses this button that turns his car into basically a mech suit. Well, like, what was your reaction to that moment?
I don't know. I mean, it really doesn't work, and it doesn't make sense. But you know what? I do have a real soft spot for 80s and 90s mecha films, particularly Gundam, and this was before Symbionic Titan came out, which I really love as well. So, I don't know, it really doesn't fit within the film and the context of the films that came before it, but I like it. But then again, that's just me on a personal, subjective level. Objectively, it really doesn't make sense, and I don't know why they put it in there. Like, it probably would have made more sense to have it be like a hijinksy kind of like race at the end. I feel like that probably would have fit more. And I know they had a lot of that in the previous two films, but like that would have made more sense, at least. But like, yeah, mecha suit. Like, I can't help but love that. But objectively, yeah, it's really stupid.
Yeah, because you have like this road trip type of thing, and there is like some fast driving and kind of racing involved. But you would really expect the showdown to be like a final race when really it's just cars and a mech suit like just ramming into each other in this like one location. It's really weird.
Yeah, in between all these like grain silos in like the middle of Wyoming, and you're just like, what is this? Like, this feels like a really Americanized version of like a cross between Gundam and PDF. Like, it's really strange.
Obviously, like Jeff Gordon and like his allies, I guess, they come out on top, and Yosemite Sam is pissed off that he lost, and Bugs is like, you'll get over it. And he's like, you really think so? And he's like, no. And then they just like walk away.
It's just like, again, there was a bit of writing like that at the time in those kind of films, but like, I actually, if it's executed well, then it is funny, and they did it really well. Like, that's what I mean, where this film fundamentally and like objectively speaking, it is flawed, but like there's a lot of like individual bits of writing that really do shine through, and that show that they did have some really good talent on this film. And I think that's one of the funnier bits of the film, because I was like actually snorted a bit when I first watched that, and I was like, okay, that's pretty good. Like, as dumb as the rest of the film is, like, that was actually really clever.
Yeah, I do think some of the like driving moments kind of dragged for a bit. Like, they were really, I don't know, like they were really trying to like hammer home that like, yeah, this is a race car movie, but it got to a point where it just got like super annoying to me in those moments.
It was just like, yes, we've all seen the first two Fast and the Furious films by this point. Like, can we have something different? But like, yeah, I don't know.
Jokes like the one we just mentioned, like where they like actually land, like those moments are really satisfying and like make even low effort movies like this one like somewhat worth watching.
Do you mean that they feel satisfying when they land because so few of the jokes throughout the rest of this film land?
Like, you have that one scene where like Bugs like comes out of a hat, and you know it's like the rabbit in the hat type of joke, and then he like pulls out some pieces of paper that have different jokes on them, and he's just throwing them out of the car, and they land on the ground, but they get like run over by other car tires, and it's like, okay, I guess they're saying that these jokes aren't landing. So like, I do kind of appreciate that self-awareness, but yeah, I mean, just overall, just tell great jokes overall. Like, you can try harder with these types of things.
Yeah. It does feel like they just got really lazy by this point. I mean, to be fair, by this point, you know, this is sixth film in the series by this point, so if the well wasn't at least starting to run dry, then clearly they were mastermind filmmakers, but they clearly weren't, so.
At the end, Jeff Gordon says he's dropping the lawsuit against the Looney Tunes, and the Tunes are like celebrating because it's like, yay, they don't have to like deal with all this courtroom stuff anymore. And the inspector gets a promotion, which I mean, they don't really specify what the promotion entails. I guess we're just supposed to assume it's a good thing for him. But yeah.
Yeah, which I don't know. I thought the writing was going to be even lazier than that for the finale of the film, but it worked out all right. Like that's the thing. Like, fundamentally, it is flawed in the sense that it's a film that's quite corporate and very product placement-y. But like in terms of like the actual narrative, it's at least like a 5 out of 10. In that sort of like it keeps to the numbers of the story like competently at least. And so I didn't mind that part of it so much. I think as dumb and as flawed as the film was, it at least ended, not in terms of the action, but in terms of the narrative and the storytelling quite well.
And like for the final shot of the film, they all decide to get in their own like race cars. It's like sort of a driving into the horizon sort of thing. And then Jeff Gordon is like, now let's do some e-racing, and like he uses like the Men in Black memory erasing device to like erase the memories of people who like don't blink at the moment. So like if they forget about this movie, they'll have to like watch it again if they think they haven't seen it.
It's I don't know. I'm not as mad about it for this one because I mean it just wasn't very good. So I mean it wasn't painfully bad, but you know it was just kind of yeah. Oh yeah, there was that weird scene, wasn't there, where like where like the inspector kind of almost betrayed them, and you thought he was a weird red herring, and then they nearly went to prison, but it was like just a weird red herring that kind of went nowhere. And it was only like about like 10 or so minutes long, that scene, but it was just like kind of plopped in there so they could have a bunch of prison jokes, and it just kind of like left it alone. I completely forgot about that, maybe because of the mind wiping technology, admittedly, but what the hell was the deal with that? Because that was really confusing.
Yeah, it felt like they were just padding the runtime with that whole sequence. Like it didn't really make sense and felt out of place.
Yeah, but I mean that's a bit of an understatement. It's pretty much pointless because it didn't drive the narrative forward at all, and the types of jokes that were in there just felt really out of place. It was really strange.
They're demonstrating what cartoons can do. Like, you know, there's a part where Bugs, like, he hits Daffy so that he becomes thinner so he's able to go between the bars of the prison cell. And it's like, okay, yeah, they're cartoons, I get it. But yeah, it just felt really cheesy and out of place, I guess. Like, it was just weird.
Yeah, I don't know. I wasn't mad about it. But, I mean, generally speaking, what would be my final thoughts about it? I think, narratively speaking, it's like a 5 or a 6 out of 10. It meets all the points. But, like, it does sort of, like, have this underlying sort of... not even underlying, sort of overlaying sort of like feel and malaise of like corporatism and sort of advertisement placement and just like being really lazy and a bit not completely cynical, but definitely very lazy and cash grabby. But I mean, it's a fun enough watch that you can just plop on in front of like your baby niece while like you go and do the chores for a couple of hours, and it does the job fine enough. So. 5.5 upsetting Nightcrawler references out of 10, I'm going to say.
All right. Yeah, that's fair. I feel like I'm in a similar boat where, like this is probably my least favorite of the Jam movies I've been talked about on the show so far. Some moments really dragged, despite this being like a race car movie, and you expect like that to be quicker and action packed, but like
yeah.
Yeah,
that's the other thing. The races are weirdly slow, and it was just like I get that they kind of had to fit in a lot of jokes, but even then, you just kind of expected it to be a bit more action-packed, I guess.
Yeah, and I did enjoy some of the jokes, but again, like it felt like they weren't trying as hard as like a couple of the previous movies. So for Race Jam, I'm gonna have to give it 6 out of 10 ketchup packs. Well, like it's a guilty pleasure, I guess. It's somewhat enjoyable, but it's just it could have been a lot better if they just tried harder.
Yeah, I'm also going to. I guess another measurement could be 5.5 out of 10. Bugs Bunny sipping a Snapple and then turning cynically towards the camera out of 10.
Nice.
Because actually, the more that I'm thinking about that part of the film, the more I'm getting really pissed off about it. Actually, 'cause that really annoyed me. It's just it's nothing else wrong with it apart from the fact that it's just really cynical and just annoying product placement.
But hey, product placement is a staple of these movies, I guess. So, yeah.
Maybe our difference in attitude towards that kind of just showcases the difference in terms like advertisements in the UK and the US, because I'm just so much used to seeing so much less of it.
Yeah, no, I mean, in other movies, I do roll my eyes at product placement, but I guess for like these jam movies, it's like, because it's like all a big joke, it's like I'm more okay with it. But like with like I saw this YouTube video that talked about product placement in the Transformers movies. I think it was by a YouTuber called Nerdstalgic, if I remember correctly. And like it just like pissed me off seeing like how much product placement there was.
It's really insulting. It's like even though it's weird, because even though the original 80s cartoon and the film in the 80s was all designed to basically sell toys, that feels less cynical because it's just like at least it was a bit more subtle.
Yeah, it was more like, you people love these characters, and so why not get a toy of this? Whereas, you saw this can of soda in the movie, go out and get it. Like, that feels more cynical. Yeah. I guess with that, we can go ahead and close out. So thanks for joining me again, Ted. Where can people find your stuff?
So I have a couple of YouTube channels. I have one channel called Gitbag the Great, spelled Gitbag the Great. That's my gaming channel. I also do the odd vlogs here and there on there. The channel I probably upload a bit more regularly on is Ted's Booze Cellar, where I do sort of alcohol reviews. I also just sometimes do food reviews on there as well. The odd occasional cooking video. I've got a third channel called Mr. Chit Chat, which I'm going to rename soon to something else. I'm going to do like probably historical and education videos on there, just sort of like a bit of a mixed bag on that one, mostly like hobby videos, I think. That's probably the places where I also link sort of to all my social medias in the video descriptions to my videos on those channels as well, so like people follow me on there wherever they fancy, really. Yeah,
I'll link those in the show notes as usual.
All right. As always, it's been an absolute pleasure being on here. Sorry if people can hear my fan in the background. It's boiling hot today, so
yeah, you have lots of fans. Like, people just love you.
Shut up. I was just thinking, like, Steven's going to make one of his f***ing shite puns again. But then it was like, we got right to the end, and I was like, oh, maybe he isn't. Maybe he's just like concentrating on the show, and then you made that, and I was just like,
yeah, I mean, earlier in the episode, you said driving the narrative, and I was going to point it out, but I didn't want to like ruin the momentum of what you were saying. But yeah, here we are.
I'm going to beat you up next time I see you. But I mean, no, I have a fan on, so I apologise if people heard that throughout the episode. It's just honestly, it's really hot today, so I thought I've got to make a trade-off of either having no fan on and having the window open, or closing the window and having the fan on. And I thought if I leave the window open, like, you'll hear loads and loads of like cars and like people going by, so I thought that would ruin the recording more, which is the main point of like people coming here. So like I thought, right, okay, I'll just have the fan on instead then. So right. Sorry if people could overhear that a little bit. That's but it's honestly, it's boiling today. I got out a beer and it's already like room temperature.
Yeah, I mean, I think I should be able to edit out the fan noises with the noise reduction tool, but the part where like I could hear cars in the background, I might leave that in because it just worked so perfectly when we were like talking about the Batmobile stuff.
yeah, I guess sort of like opportunistic theme setting. I guess it makes sense.
Right, but yeah, thanks again for joining me on this show, Ted. I really appreciate it.
No worries, it's been an absolute pleasure, and feel free to ask me for any of my much more negative and aggressively cynical opinions in the future.
Yeah, I mean, if any of you listeners have any negative or cynical opinions, you can email delayedreplaypodcast@gmail.com, and we might read your thoughts on the show within reason. Like, of course, it depends on like how you say it or whatever, but yeah. You can also find me at Steven Shinder on Instagram and Twitter, Steven Shinder Storytelling on Facebook. You can find my fantasy horror comedy novel, Lemons Will Make Rain, on Amazon. More info at stevenshinder.com. Still working on the second book. So yeah, whenever there's news on that, I'll like say so. You can also find episodes of Star Trek Culture that I've been on. I'll link those in the show notes as well. And I was recently on an episode of Execute Order 99 over on Dr. Holocron's YouTube channel, talking about the Bad Batch episode Battle Scars. So I'll link that as well. And again, this episode, since it's coming out like in the middle of the week instead of Saturday, there will be no new episode this coming Saturday, the 19th, because I realized last minute that that day is Juneteenth, and I just feel like there's going to be more important discussions posted that day, so I didn't want to like put this episode out on that day. So yeah, and so the next new episode will come out the following Saturday on the 26th, and it'll be about the Batman, the Robert Pattinson one. But without further delay, have a good day.
And don't eat the yellow stuff under the sink.